Well, good evening. I'm very thankful for this opportunity to be able to be on the last night of VBS. I think that VBS has been wonderful this year, and I'm glad to be a little part of that. Anderson and I last night got to teach the 6th, 7th, and 8th year olds, so that's quite a difference a little bit from that age group to this age group. But I think, and I know that I will enjoy teaching and talking to you both. And I'll try not to put you to sleep because I know it's been a very, very long week as well. Throughout history, there have been several famous assassination attempts. The picture depicted here comes a very famous phrase, et tu, Brute, or in our English, you too, Brutus. The scene depicted here is Julius Caesar getting stabbed by many of his statesmen in the play, but also Brutus, one of his trusted advisors, killing him. More recently, or maybe more known to us, the top men pictured above share the common, although not very likable fate of being presidents of our nation, of the United States of America, but all four of them at different points in their presidency were assassinated by someone shooting them, and they all died while they were in office. The men on the bottom had assassination attempts on them. President Roosevelt, at the bottom of the left, had someone shoot him, and the bullet actually went through a book that was in his pocket, similarly, or interestingly enough. And then President Reagan, who probably the majority of you guys may have some recollection maybe of that in this room, is the most recent president to have had an assassination attempt on his life, although thankfully that was unsuccessful. And then President Franklin Roosevelt and President Gerald Ford, they had assassination attempts on their lives. However, they were not injured, but they had people that were either in their service that they were injured or that they died, but they actually were not harmed. And there's actually several other attempts that had been made on presidents' lives that did not affect them. It affected their assassins, though, of course. Harry Truman, who is not pictured, also had an assassination attempt on his life. So what does that have to do, though, with our lesson tonight? Well, when we turn to the book of 1 Samuel, and if you will, turn to 1 Samuel chapter number 16, our story tonight really takes place from 1 Samuel 16 to 1 Samuel chapter 31. Now, I don't know, but if we took all of our time tonight, we probably could read 1 Samuel 16 through 31 and read about David and Saul's relationship with one another and how that kind of evolved over time. But that is not what we are going to be doing tonight. Instead, what I want us to really focus on and see is who really is the king of this story. Now, the story is about two earthly kings. It's about two of the nation of Israel's first kings. But really what I want us to see at the end of this lesson especially is who is the ultimate king. And I think we know that that is going to be God. But what's that about? And then what are some of the differences and the similarities between King Saul and King David? Now, at the very start of 1 Samuel, when you go to chapter number 16, you'll find that David becomes anointed, and that happens by Samuel going to him. Now, it's interesting to note to me that the story starts by saying that Samuel was grieving for Saul. Why would Samuel be grieving for Saul? Why did the Lord have to tell him not to? Well, if you go back one chapter, in chapter number 15, you'll find that the kingdom of Israel was stripped away from Saul because Saul was disobedient to God. And again, we don't have time much to go into more of the backstory of Saul, but at one point in time, Saul was the undisputed king of Israel. He was the man who God chose among everyone else in the land to be his first king. When you think about the implications of that, of who the first king is, the first president of our United States is very highly revered and respected. George Washington, that is one of the best presidents that we think of when we think of who our great leaders have been. And for the nation of Israel to be the first king, that would have been a great and a high honor that Saul would have had. But unfortunately, he fell from that very high place, and the Lord rejected him in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when you come to that part of the story, David comes and he becomes the one who is anointed to be king at a younger age, seemingly. And he does not immediately become king. Saul still reigns in the nation of Israel during this time, and it seems to be that this is hidden by almost everyone. The only people who really know that probably David is king at this point are Samuel, God, and David's family. Quite likely are the only people in 1 Samuel 16 who know about this. But interestingly, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, King Saul makes David his armor bearer, and he also invites David to come to his house to play a harp for him, because Saul had this distrusting spirit within him that hurt him. And we probably really don't likely know all the implications and ramifications of that. But as we're going to see, Saul made a lot of poor choices because he did not have the faith. He did not have the Spirit of God that was within David. And that's what I want us to kind of see at first, is as we've already talked about the previous nights of VBS, David and Saul have this relationship. In 1 Samuel 17, which we already talked about earlier this week, David kills Goliath, and Saul is very excited about this. Goliath was a very great enemy of Israel, and Saul trusts David. But if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 18, if you'll turn over there, I like to call 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse number 7, Israel's number one hit on the top 100, okay? In 1 Samuel chapter 18, in verse number 7, it says, "So the women sang as they danced and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens thousands.'" Now, again, this is the ancient world and such. This is the time before Christ and such. So for us, probably today, it's probably not a brag if you said, "Alan has slain his thousands, but Adrian has slain his tens of thousands." Like, that really doesn't hit quite the same way, right? It's really not a compliment. But for this land, for this day and age, this time, this would have been a huge deal, right? The nation of Israel is having to war against so many different tribes and different nations that they had surrounding them. And they wouldn't have had to earlier if the people had obeyed God, and like Joshua told them to drive the people out, a separate lesson. But David is a great warrior for Saul and for the nation of Israel, and he's an asset to them. And it's probably, for us, again, it'd be no snuff to say, "You've slain your thousands." But Saul, in his anger and in his fear, he becomes jealous. And in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse number 12, it says, "Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul." The Lord was with David. We already stated that the Lord had left Saul. So Saul begins to become afraid. But this is not the only section that we see this. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, in verse number 15, we see in the previous verse that David had started to act wisely. But it says here, "Therefore when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he, Saul, was afraid of him," David, because David was acting wisely in all of his doings before Saul. And then we could spend the rest of our time talking about kind of the way the rest of 1 Samuel 18 transpires, but it's a big family drama. It begins with King Saul that he's going to promise David that he's going to give David one of his daughters. But actually he backs out and doesn't give him the first daughter. He gives him another daughter, second daughter. Again, time would fail us to get into the whole story of this. But that doesn't really work out well for Saul either, that he gives the daughter of the king. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 28 and 29, it says, "Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him," loved David. "And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually." Saul became David's enemy continually. That's exactly the words I want to hear from my father-in-law one day, right? That he's my enemy continually. No, not really. This would not be a very good, honestly, family dynamic. But why did that happen? How was it that Saul, in the beginning of the relationship with David, he had some amount of respect for David, that he put David as his armor bearer, his trusted man who would be right by his side. And then David goes out and he kills Goliath. He kills this great enemy of Israel, and he starts slaying these tens of thousands. And then Saul changes, right? Saul becomes afraid, and his fear leads him to make some very, very poor choices. And our fear can also have the same effect on us, as we will see later. But as we know, Saul doesn't just stop at being afraid of David. Saul is going to take action. After all, he is the king. He is going to do something about this. And again, if you want another fun chapter to read with your kids tonight, read 1 Samuel chapter 19. Probably don't do that, especially towards some of the stuff at the end. But there's some very interesting things that happen in 1 Samuel chapter 19 if you've not read that recently. But in verse number 1, we see the beginnings of Saul to take action against David. And he tells all of his officials, hey, this David guy, I don't like him anymore, and I want to kill him, is basically how that goes in verse number 1. In verse number 2, Jonathan, who, again, Saul very much greatly trusts, Jonathan is the son of Saul, he goes to tell David because they have a great relationship, as we've talked about earlier this week at VBS. And he tells David to hide in verses number 2 and 3. In verses 4 and 5, Jonathan goes to Saul, his father, and in an act of courage and also an act of love to David, he tries to convince Saul, David has done you no wrong. He is one of your most trusted advisors. Why are you trying to kill him? Why would you want to do this? This would severely hurt us in so many different ways. And thankfully, in a way, Saul listens to Jonathan. He relents for the time being, the very short time being, as we'll see repeatedly, that he is not going to take action against David. And David comes back into Saul's presence in 1 Samuel chapter 19 in verse number 7. But in a one verse for us, and we don't really know how much time passed, in 1 Samuel chapter 19 in verse number 7, the end of that passage says, so Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. And then verse number 8, the way that begins, it says, there was a war again. So we're not exactly told explicitly what the timeline of this would have been. For us, it's one verse. So it seems really quick that Saul went from not killing David to there being this war again. But what happens in this war and how much time elapsed, we don't really know. But in verse number 8, David goes, and as he does, David cleans house with the Philistines. It's another common theme that we see throughout 1 Samuel. But Saul has this harmful spirit again in verse number 9. That harmful spirit comes up. And whenever that happens, you can pretty much bank on the fact that things are going to happen. And David, though, to his credit, he is playing the music again for Saul. In verse number 9, he comes back from the war effort. One minute he's slaying Philistines, next minute he's playing music. I don't know how you could do that with a good conscience somewhat, but again, it's different times, right? It's different stuff happening, going on. But in verse number 10 is the first, and I would say probably the closest that Saul ever comes to actually killing David physically. In verse number 10 it says, then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. But he, David, slipped away from Saul's presence, and Saul drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. This was the closest, again, that Saul came to killing David. But Saul doesn't stop there. Now, I don't know, you probably don't have a spear in your house. I don't think we have a spear in our house. We maybe have a few swords or lightsabers or all kinds of different other weapons. But if you put yourself in the position of Saul and you've just done this deed, if you've thrown your spear, I mean, the guy is a man of war, and he he has done a lot of atrocious bad things to this point. But if you realize who David was, at least, David, again, he's slain these tens of thousands for Saul. He's Saul's son-in-law. Him and Jonathan have this amazing relationship. It would seem unfathomable for us to take action against someone who has done so much for us, or someone who should mean so much to us in our life. But what does Saul do? Well, Saul doesn't just stop by attacking David. As we see, Saul starts with fear, and he starts with a lot of jealousy, but Saul has progressed to the point of violence. He's progressed to the point of anger, and he's not just going to take that anger out on David, but he's also going to take that out on many other people. 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 17, we're going to go through this a little bit more quickly. Saul goes to David's house, and he's basically telling them, hey, bring David out of his own house. It's the middle of the night, but bring him out in the morning, and I'm going to kill him, and such. But David is able to escape because of his wife, Michal, who is Saul's daughter, helps David to escape. And again, the details are within the story. And Saul goes to Michal. When he figures this out, he goes to his daughter and he says, why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away so that he was escaped? Now, Michal, probably in a very empathetic way of fear, her fear is probably very understandable at this point. She lies to Saul and says, David said to me, let me go, why should I kill you? And that's not really what actually happens when you read the rest of the text and the account. So David takes action against his daughter after taking action against his son-in-law, but it does not read that he did anything else to her. He just gave her a really bad reprimand. But in 1 Samuel chapter 19, in the preceding verses with verse number 22, very specifically, it says, then he, Saul, also went to Ramah and came to the great well that is at Succoth. So he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? Now, what happens in this story, again, trying to rush through it a little bit, but Saul had sent messengers to go and find David. But he figures out that David is with Samuel. And Samuel, at the very least, we know that Samuel thinks very highly of Saul. Remember earlier, he was mourning that Saul had been rejected as king. And he was very upset at this. It seems that Samuel had at least some kind of relationship with King Saul, but this is probably one of the final nails in the coffin for that relationship to be a healthy one, because Saul sends all these messengers and they start prophesying and stuff, and then Saul actually goes and he starts prophesying as well. And there's some other interesting details, again, you can read that in your own time and such at the end of the chapter that you might find very interesting and insightful. But not only was Saul angry with one of his most trusted men, David, who has done all these amazing things. He gets mad at his daughter. He gets mad and takes action against Samuel, who's a prophet of God, who should have been a friend to Saul. Saul also becomes angry and takes action against Jonathan. And this is a story in 1 Samuel chapter 20 that I had not really thought about or read much until recently preparing for this. But Saul, one of the worst things I think that Saul does is the verbal abuse, and ultimately the physical action that he takes against Jonathan is extreme in every single sense of the word. It says in verse number 30, of 1 Samuel 20, Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan because of David, because of their friendship, the relationship that they've had. But not only was he angry with Saul, and not only was Saul angry with Jonathan, Saul cast his spear at Jonathan to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. I mean, I can't help but imagine that Jonathan, after talking to Saul, as much as Jonathan knew that Saul was a bad dude and had done a lot of bad things, you have to think, as a son to a father, he's trying to save his father. He's trying to stop David from doing these awful, horrible things. But then in verse number 34, in verse number 33, kind of the light bulb goes off for Jonathan. It says, so Jonathan arose from the table in burning and fierce anger, and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had treated him shamefully. And again, if you want to read the verbal abuse that happens, that Saul says, read verses 31 through 32. There's some not nice words and phrases that Saul very much utters to his son David, or his son Jonathan, excuse me. But Jonathan, again, we kind of see, if you go back to the relationship that we talked about earlier in the week between Jonathan and David, they are very close friends. They're the best of friends. They are very tight. And I can't imagine, again, the love that Jonathan would have had for David and the love, the respect that ultimately he would have tried to have for his father, and those two things clashing together. Saul hurts his son in a very powerful way, like he's hurt a lot of other people. And then also Saul takes action against ultimately God. And we kind of see that throughout all of his interactions that he has had. But in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 18, 19, I'm not going to go into the full details of the story, but one of the places that had housed David, that had kept David refuge and had actually given David a sword and food, Saul finds out that these people had done that, and he tells Doeg, who's an Edomite, he says, you're basically going to wipe these people out. If you see that bold place right there, that 85 men that Saul has commissioned, Saul commissions this Edomite to kill 85 priests of God. Like the king of Israel, who should be one of the most holy, one of the most reverent, one of the most people who should represent what Israel is. He is the one who commissions this foreigner to them, to the Israelites, which would have been unthinkable in a lot of ways, to kill 85 priests, people who were innocent, men who were innocent, who served God. That's one of the awful, atrocious things that Saul does. He goes against God. And as we see, 1 Samuel chapter 23, verse 14, I think is kind of a summary statement in a way. It says, David stayed in the strongholds in the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. But Saul, what does he do? He sought him, David, every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. I cannot imagine being so, again, consumed with anger, with fear, with hatred, that I am attempting to kill someone every single day. Like, let that thought completely take you over. But that's how Saul's fear progressed. That's how not having the Spirit of God, but having that evil spirit within him, that's where Saul got to, in a very, very dark place. But I want to ask this question. If Saul was Saul was my king, and this is just something I want you to think about in your mind. We're going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of the lesson. But if Saul was your king, this manic, angry, bloodthirsty king, if he was your king, if that was who your king was, how would you act? How would you handle that situation? Want him off the throne, for sure, right? Just keep that in the back of your mind for a little bit. And we're going to think about that question, but also I want us to think about what would have had to be going through David's mind. We're going to kind of shift gears from thinking about all the things that Saul has done to really thinking about David at this point. David would have been somewhere out probably in a wilderness that looked maybe something like that, maybe, quite possibly. And if we're David, and if I was David, and if I was anointed king, I don't know exactly how I would act. I mean, we're obviously not in David's situation. But what does David do during this time? Well, again, we could spend a whole lesson about that. But David ultimately, what he does is he spares Saul, which he had every opportunity in a lot of ways not to. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and chapter 26 about two separate occasions that David could have ended Saul's life. Now keep in mind, again, David is a man of war. David has killed his tens of thousands. David is anointed by God. He would seem to have every single right in the world to realize, hey, like, if God is putting Saul in this situation where I can take his life, I got to take him out. Like, that seems to be what God's wanting. Also during this time, it's very likely, very probable, David is in his 20s, which, again, in Bible times, they're the same, obviously, in number, but in maturity in other ways that could be different. But David's my age, like around what I would be. David's in his 20s while all these things are going on. And as someone who is in that spot, I guess, one of the things that we struggle with my generation or my age group, I would say, is it's very hard to be patient right? It's very hard to wait for whatever to happen, and especially in an age where you can get on your phone, you can look anything up in minutes and get it, and you can go through a drive-thru and get food within 5 minutes. Everything is so instantaneous, instant gratification. What does David do? When he had the opportunity to take Saul out, what does he do? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse number 4, I encourage you to read both of these chapters in your own time to see the full details, the full depth of what goes on here. But in verse number 4 of 1 Samuel chapter 24, David goes and he cuts off Saul's garment while Saul in his very compromised position, to put it lightly. And if you've read the story, you know what I'm talking about. In contrast, in 1 Samuel chapter 26, when Saul is asleep in the middle of the night in his tent, in the middle of the camp, he goes and he takes Saul's spear and he takes his water jug. That's two of the actions he takes against Saul, but he doesn't kill Saul. And then in both instances of the story, David just doesn't run off with Saul's spear, or he doesn't just run off with this linen garment. No, when Saul realizes, when he wakes up, or when David calls after him, Saul listens, and David calls after him in chapter 24 and verse 26. But also, one of the first things that David does, and one of the things I think that's very interesting, is David just asks Saul, he's like, "Why are you hunting me down?" In a way is what David said, which wouldn't you also like to know probably why someone's hunting you down and such? And David has, though, the courage to do that. And I think it's interesting if you go to chapter 24 too, before David even does that, David respects Saul enough, which is a big word or a key word for us tonight. David respects Saul enough in chapter 24 that he bows down and gives homage to King Saul before saying anything. Like, he gives the respect to Saul. Even though Saul is trying to kill him, he says, "My Lord, the King." And everything really that David does in both of these chapters, David is very respectful. And he asks Saul, though, "Are you listening to men who are trying to tell you that I'm trying to kill you? Or are you listening to God?" And Saul, of course, realizes a little bit the error of his ways. But David, in chapter 24 and chapter 26, David says that the Lord is going to take care of both of us. He's going to be the judge between both of us. Really the key is in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse number 6, which says, "The Lord forbid," this is David speaking, when his group of men, his mighty men who were telling him, "David, this is your chance. This is your opportunity, buddy. We've been in the wilderness for so long. We've not been able to see our wives, not been able to see our families. We've not been these great soldiers of war for Saul like we have been previously. Now is your time to seize the throne. He's right there. You gotta take him out." David, though, says this in 1 Samuel 24, verse 6. He says, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed," talking about King Saul, "to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." I think David has to realize when he's gone throughout all these wilderness wanderings, and at the same time, we're able to see in the Psalms that David is writing some of those as he is on the run, as he is being chased by Saul. David realizes who the king is. There is a king in Israel that is not David at that time. It's King Saul. But David says, "I cannot take this action against Saul because God chose him. God made him the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to be the one to stretch out my hand against him." And really that's saying, I think, who his trust in God is. And I think that's the big difference. The big contrast between Saul and David is their faith. And that may seem like a very simple answer, but their faith, or their relationship they had with God, the trust that they had, is very stark, is very apparent. Saul is a man that so often is characterized by fear, both in this story and in other stories. But David is a man of courage. He's a man of faith that runs after God with all he has. And does he make mistakes? Absolutely, he does. But David, at the end of the day, realizes and pours out his heart to God and asks and says, "Lord, you be the judge. You're the one who has to make all of these things right. And David ultimately, with all the self-control, like even getting that close to Saul, enough to be able to cut off the piece of his garment and not take his life like he had taken tons of lives before, speaks volumes to the character of David, the self-control, the love, the respect that David had for his God, but also for King Saul. I want to give you, maybe if you like alliteration, some things to think about. Where I think Saul failed and where David succeeded. And these could be a sermon of itself, so I'm just going to state these things briefly. Saul was characterized by fear and the loss of popularity. Who knows? I mean, it was probably a very catchy song. Saul is slaying his thousands, David is slaying his 10,000s. That doesn't exactly roll off the tongue for us, but I can't help but imagine that was repeat and playing in Saul's head, like the songs that we think of that stick in our heads today. That fear, that envy that he had to be a constant reminder for him. Saul failed because of his folly and letting his anger take control. Saul hurt his family, Saul hurt his God, and Saul hurt his nation by letting his folly and letting ultimately his foolishness and his anger, by letting those things take control of his life instead of having faith in God. And as you see, the foolishness in listening to unwise counsel, we're not told who Saul might have been listening to in this. At the very least, he was listening to his own self. He was listening to his own heart about trying to kill and go after David. But what made David so special? I think David's reverence for God. And again, like I said, David wrote so many of our Psalms, and some of those you can see that David wrote in the wilderness while he was being chased by Saul. And David made mistakes like that. That is very apparent. But David was saved by his faith that he had in God, by having his heart, and by trying to obey God to the very best of his ability. And that's what made him different than Saul. Saul really had a lack of faith. God was not the center of his life like it seems to be that David's was. He respected Saul. He saw him as the Lord's anointed, which is very interesting. And he also relied on God's timing. Again, he's 20 while he's being chased throughout these things. He had ultimate patience. He had ultimate respect and love for God. Something else I want to really kind of think about and really try to emphasize is found in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse number 8. And this really has to do with the way that David views himself, and ultimately I think how we need to view ourselves and how we can view our God, but also how we can view people. I'm going to try to do this in a very timely but correct fashion. So in 2 Samuel chapter 7, in verse number 8, this is how David describes who he is, or really what's going on. It says, "Now therefore thus shall you say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the sheepfold, the following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel." If you go back a chapter in verse number 6 and verse number 21, it says that David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord over Israel. Therefore I will play music before the Lord." Now, what's interesting for our discussion is that word ruler that you see in both of those chapters. That word can also be translated prince. It can mean different things. But what's interesting, though, is that word is different than the word king. And I'm not going to try to make too much of this, but I think it is apparent through not just these passages, but the rest of our story, what we talked about. David did not view himself as the king. David viewed himself as a prince and a ruler over Israel, for sure a leader over Israel. But he gave that status to God, and I think that's very apparent. Saul, on the other hand, while he may not have called himself king, very much probably viewed himself as the king and such. In all the actions that he took, he made himself God by taking violence into his own hands, whereas David withdrew and did not have that violence towards Saul. And something else I want us to think about is in that posture of thinking about who is the king. Of course, we don't have a king today in our land, but Daniel chapter 4, verse 17 says, "This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know." Basically, this angel of the Lord, this messenger of God, is telling at this time King Nebuchadnezzar He's telling that the living may know this, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets it over the lowest of men. From that, and from really looking at the totality of Scripture, what this angel, what this messenger is saying to these people is, it is God, and it's always God, who is the one who is in control. He is king. It doesn't matter what nations on earth. It doesn't matter who their leaders are. God is always king. That never changes. And he gives the kingdoms. He gives the exterior, the door drapings, as you might say, the window dressings, to different rulers. And he gives it to whomever he will. But for us tonight, Romans 13, verse number 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and authorities that exist are appointed by God. Tonight, what I want us to think about as you go home, as you think about what this lesson means, when you think about King Saul, when you think about King David, is the question, is it obvious who is king of your life? See, there's a lot of kings that can be in our lives. If you place citizenship in another land, you could have a king, you could have an emperor, you could have any number of monarchs. Since you are a resident of this land, we have a president, we have congressional leaders, we have judicial people in our justice systems. And Romans chapter 13 and verse number 1 says that we have to be subject. We have to respect our leaders. And I'm not, again, don't want to make this at all political at all tonight. But really the point of what the story, one of the reasons that it may be here for us tonight is we see a crazy, wild, violent king in the person of Saul and all the harm that he caused. But we see more powerfully, and I hope very vividly, we see a God who works, who is faithful, and who delivers David. And David has faith in that God, in that king, throughout everything in this story. It is God who is the one who is in control. And David, unlike Saul, he does not let fear control him. He doesn't let his anger mount because he does not have that fear. He trusts in the Lord God. So tonight, for us, what I want you to think about and take away, there's probably a lot of different things, and you decide for that. But are you letting fear, or are you letting jealousy, are you letting your judgment on different people's characters, or any number of things, are you letting that color how you are subject to an earthly ruler, or how you are letting that affect your relationship with your God? That's something between you and God. That doesn't have to be necessarily something that is a public confession. But if we are to be honest with what Scripture has told us, we have one king, and that is God. And we have to be people who exemplify that to the entire world. We cannot be people that are characterized by fear, who are characterized by judgment. We want to stand for the truth. We want to proclaim that. We want to exemplify Christ, who is our King. But we also want to be subject. We want to be humble for him. And again, that's also a lesson that can be in and of itself. So tonight, respect the King. Very much thankful for this opportunity tonight to be able to have this time at Vacation Bible School. If you guys have any questions you'd like to talk about or bring up, very happy to take those. But is it 6:55 where the people are supposed to take their? So we got 4 minutes for any questions. You guys have?
Do you think Saul was jealous of David?
Yes, for sure. Yes.
Adrian,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your comment on the distressing spirit.
Yeah.
One place it says that God sent it on Saul.
Right.
So I guess the question, excuse me, that that I have is, number one, what is that spirit? Number
Right.
two, could Saul be held accountable for his actions?
Right, for sure. So Brother Life asked the question, in one of the parts of the story, we were told that God sends this distressing spirit upon Saul. And does that mean that Saul is accountable for his actions? And to that, I'd answer, absolutely, yes, he is still accountable for his actions. We read in the book of Exodus that Pharaoh is the one who, it's told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And again, we kind of scratch our heads and we say, well, is God forcing Pharaoh to not let Israel go? Is he forcing Saul to take these wrong actions? And I don't think so. I think what God has done in the story and such, we read that God cannot be tempted by anyone, and he cannot be the tempter. We read that in the New Testament. And God cannot, but God can test. And we probably don't know all the inner workings of how that works. But I think very practically, if I are to let our soul get to a point where we're living without God, that's going to be distressing. That's going to be a very dark place. And because God is not with us, that may hurt us in a lot of different ways and such. Yeah.
There's some commentary that would even say that he, if Saul was living in today's time, you wonder if he wasn't being diagnosed with some sort of mental illness.
Right.
Aside from that, I look at the account with Jonathan, and even with the way David had a relationship with some of his sons, do you think that the relationship between father and son at that time was the same as we see it today?
Right. That's a really good question. So Brother Brandon asked the question, does the relationship between father and son in that time, would that be somewhat similar to what we think of in today? And I would think of the totality of Scripture as well in answering this question. We read that Jacob is very close to his son Joseph in the Bible, and he trusts him very emphatically. And we're not explicitly told, I would say, what Saul and Jonathan's relationship was, but because Jonathan is the one who's mentioned, and Jonathan is also mentioned being a great man of war, he had a bow. I would think it'd be very likely that there would be some level of trust or respect there. That like King Saul is going into his army, like, who do you want by your side? Well, probably the guy who has the bow and can hit someone before he gets to you in the line of battle if you're the king, and for that person to be your son too. It's maybe a likely, very positive relationship they had.
Brother Adrian,
Yeah.
on the comment you made on Pharaoh,
Yeah.
I think it says, Pharaoh hardened his heart, God hardened his heart, and the magician.
Yes.
And so I've thought that, well, God, it would be against his nature to cause a person to behave a certain way.
Right.
So I've thought on Pharaoh that God created a situation, where,
Yes.
Pharaoh made the choices that he did.
Right.
So do I hear you saying similarly with Saul, that with the context with David, being the next king, and the people, bragging on him like they were doing, would cause Saul to become jealous and so forth.
Right.
So that would be the distressing spirit, which comes as a result of the context that God has created.
Yes, for
Does
sure.
that make sense?
Yes, for sure. So Brother Life goes on to kind of explain the previous question, that the situation that God has crafted and Saul by his own actions and his own choices, the situation that both of those things kind of collided or came together, that's what led to Saul having a distressing spirit. That's what led him to taking so many different wrong actions and stuff. And also I'd add to that as well, like, it could be the same thing with Judas that we read about in the New Testament. We read that Satan entered him. And did Judas have a choice? Satan is fully in him. Or so does Satan force him to do that? Or is it the fact that Judas let Satan enter him? That's probably where I would land. He let Satan enter him. He let him control his own actions. He was responsible for his own choices, though. Yeah. Right. Yes, for sure. So we read about that God uses Pharaoh. He uses different leaders to accomplish his different purposes. And whether that's Pharaoh, the nation of Israel, whether that's King Nebuchadnezzar that we briefly thought about tonight in Daniel 4, we don't know how explicitly God works in our lives in the kingdoms of men, but it's very much apparent that he does. He's doing something, and we need to be living according to him to be on the right side. I think it's a good place to end tonight. It is 6:55, I do believe, so I'll view ones with little ones if you will go and get those. If you have any further questions, if you want to talk to me in private or whatever, I'm glad to hear that as well. But thank you guys for your time tonight. Appreciate it.